Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. We are KMOS Consulting. My name is Yash, and I'm presenting today with my teammates, Valerie, Marco, and Brian. So, for our DAT 490 capstone, we chose the dataset from Lending Club, which in its time was one of the largest online lending platforms in the US. What drew us to this project is that lending sits on a simple but high stakes tension. So a lender wants to approve as many good borrowers as possible while avoiding the ones who will not pay them back. And they have to price every loan correctly to stay competitive. Get that wrong in one direction, and you lose money to defaults. Get it wrong in the other, and you lose customers to a cheaper competitor. So we built models around two questions that go straight into that tension. First, can we predict which loans are likely to default before they go bad? And second, can we predict the interest rate a loan is assigned at the moment it is approved? We work with the full loan history, which is approximately 2.26 million loans issued between 2007 and 2018. I'll open with our high level findings and then walk you through the company, the data, and the two questions from there. My teammates will take you into the methods and results. So before we get into the details, here is sort of the big picture. The first finding is that default is only partly predictable. One important design choice we made early on was to build a separate model for each credit grade rather than one model for the whole portfolio. That gives us 21 models in total. Even so, our best classifier reached at an accuracy score of 0.61. To put that in plain terms, it is clearly better than guessing, but it's not strong enough. The second finding is almost like a mirror image. Interest rates turned out to be highly predictable. So when we let our models use Lending Club's own internal subgrade as an input, they explain only about 96% of the variation. In other words, once you know the grade Lending Club assigned, you can essentially reconstruct the price yourself. And the third finding is the most interesting one. We wanted to know how much the borrower's own profile explains, separate from the lending club's internal rating. So we ran every model a second time with the subgrade removed. Accuracy dropped to about 50%, which sounds like a big fall. But think about what that means. Without the platform's own ratings, just the borrower and loan features still explain half of the price. And the two strongest drivers were the borrower's FICO score and the loan term. So the borrower's profile carries real independent signal about what will be charged. We'll return to all three of these later, but that is the story overall. Let me give you some quick background on Lending Club and the dataset itself. So Lending Club operated as a peer-to-peer marketplace. So instead of a bank funding loans off its own balance sheet, individual investors put up the money and the borrowers applied for unsecured personal loans on their platform. Investors then decided which loans to fund by looking at the loan's grade, its interest rate, and the borrower's income, debt to income ratio, and the credit history. The structure is exactly why the data is so useful for studying credit risk. Every loan in the file comes paired with the borrower's profile at the time and the eventual outcome, whether it was fully paid or charged off. The scale here is what makes the analysis possible. We had about 2.26 million approved loans spanning 12 years from 2007 to 2018, and the original file contained 151 variables describing each one. Those loans are sorted into seven credit grades, A to G, and each grade split into five subgrades. So that's 35 in all, from A1 being the safest down to G5 being the riskiest. And that grade structure is more than a label. It turns out to be the single most powerful variable in the entire dataset. And it shows up in both of our questions. It is the reason why we chose to model each grade separately for our default, so that the grade itself would not drown out the other signals. And that is also the reason interest rate is so easily predictable when the grade is present. Keep that idea in mind because it is a thread that runs throughout the whole project. And so that brings us to our two research questions that organize our work. So research question one is about the default risk. We asked which borrower and loan features are the strongest predictors of whether a loan defaults and how accurately we can predict it when we build a separate model for each grade. This is a classification problem because the outcome is a yes or a no. Either the loan was charged off or it was fully paid. Why does this matter in the real world? Is because a default is costly on both sides. For the borrower, it damages their credit for years, and for lender, widespread defaults push up the cover and the cost itself for borrowing for everyone, because those losses get priced back into future loans. So being able to spot risk early is central to keep those rates fair and keep the business healthy. Research question 2 is about pricing. We asked whether the features in the data set let us reliably predict the interest rate a loan receives at the origination. This one is a regression problem because the target is a continuous number, the rate itself. This matters because the interest rate is one of the biggest factors in where a borrower chooses to make their loan. Price too high and you lose good customers. Price too low for the risk and you lose money for sure. So accurate, well-calibrated pricing is a genuine competitive advantage. So the same data set, two very different problems and two different sets of models for each. With that foundation in place, I'll hand it over to my teammates who will walk you through how we clean the data and methodology we use to build and validate everything.
Hello. So in this slide, we're going to go over the cleaning of the data and the features that we selected. So before we could run any models, we had to get the data into a usable state. So the raw Lending Club dataset started with 151 variables across 2.26 million loans. We dropped features that held zero predictive value. So think of features like the URL or member ID. For both research questions, we removed variables with very high null rates with a threshold of 50%. So those with high null rates under 50%, we decided to impute the median value so that we can retain an accurate data set. As for how we went about choosing our features for each research question, we use a point biserial correlation for numerical features in the first research question, and Kramer's V for categorical variables also in the first research question. And what this did was it was able to show us which features had the best association with our target variable. And that target variable in the first research question was charged off loans. And because this one was a binary dependent variable, and our second research question is a continuous dependent variable, we were dealing with interest rates as our dependent variable. We had to use different metrics. So for numerical values, we used Pearson's correlation. And to check and mitigate any multi-collinearity happening, we used a heat map. So we had all our variables on the X and Y axis, and we were able to see if there's any associations between features that would be affecting the models. And for example, we had a situation where revolving credit utilization and credit utilization had high association. This is because the variables are very similar and a lot of features we found appear to be very repetitive. So in those cases, we decided to drop one of the features. That way we can also retain an accurate data set. And for research question 1, we filtered down to only resolved loans, either fully paid or charged off loans, leaving us with about 1.3 million observations. And for research question 2, we were able to retain the 2.2 million observations for loans in our models. The end result was two well prepared, distinct data sets tailored to the specific demands of each modeling problem.
My name's Brian. I am going to walk you through methodology and research question 1. So to kind of start from the top of this thing, we obtained our data from publicly available records. We grabbed this off of Kaggle. It is all the Lending Club loan records from 2007 to 2018. We cleaned and prepared this using Python and R. Our data cleaning process was nothing special and included duplicate removal, standardization of our categorical values, and replacing nulls with appropriate values, 0 or median as the case may be. Our feature engineering included the creation of derived variables where it was appropriate. We validated everything in the same way. That was tenfold cross-validation. We did that on every model just to make sure that no single split drove the numbers, so that there was no weird anything in one train test split. Hyperparameter tuning, we did that as time permitted, but due to the tight turnarounds, we wanted to make sure that we were meeting those deadlines. So we were only able to do a few things. A couple specifics we were able to get done. Tree depth and splitting criteria were evaluated for decision tree. And when it came to light GBM, in research question 2, we did address learning rate. To focus on research question 1 for a moment, to support the modeling process, I do want to note that only loans with a final outcome of fully paid or charged off were retained for our default prediction analysis. So what does that mean? That means we ignored loans that were currently in repayment. This data set is approximately 2.2 million points of data, as Yaj pointed out at the beginning of this presentation. Cutting out the loans that were in the process of being paid off cut us down to approximately 1 million data points, which is still plenty to train our model. When it came to this, we trained 3 classifiers across all 7 of our grades. We broke out into each grade just because the grades were the strongest signal in here. And if we hadn't done that, it would have been the strongest predictor, and there wouldn't have been any other. It would have been too much noise. So for research question 1, we took that classification, logistic regression, ridge classifier, our decision tree model, and we broke it out by grade. So we did 1 model of each per grade, so 21 different models. They were judged primarily on area under curve, but we also did some F1 analysis. For research question 2, these were regression analysis. We trained 3 regressors and ran each one twice. First, we ran it on the entire data set without any grade or subgrade breakdown. And then after that, we did separate out by subgrade just because we wanted to get a little more granular with our data and see where we could end up, and judge mainly on root mean square error. And Val will tell you a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. But I'm going to step on to question 1. So just to give you a quick refresher on question 1, it was, which features are the strongest predictors of default and how accurately can we predict it? So for this question, logistic regression came out on top with a mean area of under curve of 0.61. Now, if you look at the chart here, we will see that 0.61 is the highest number, but it's pretty close. All 3 were within range of 0.61 to 0.597. So while they're all pretty close, none of them are significantly better than random chance. So none of our models performed particularly well for research question 1. So let's take a look at what drives default risk. Across all of our models, we did find some agreement on those drivers of defaults. On the risk raising side, things that increased risk, higher debt to income ratio, higher interest rate, everything that you would expect. Some things I do want to point out: the 60-month term loan categories were broken out into either 60-month or 36-month terms. So the longer loan was a higher default risk. The only other one that really stood out that might make you think a little bit would be the income marked as verified, raising the default rate. So at first that might seem a little odd for verified income to be a increase in default risk, until you think about it and you say, okay, well, That reflects LendingClub's verifying of riskier applicants a little bit more often, right? You want to make sure that your riskier applicants are actually going to, have their income verified, as opposed to people who are a little bit less risk. They have a higher FICO credit score, they have more mortgage accounts or a higher average account balance. They have those other flags that will tell you they're a lower score, a lower default risk. So maybe verification isn't necessary for them. Next up, reading the results. I do want to touch on this really quickly. Because most of our loans were fully paid, the models that we made could post high accuracy just by predicting fully paid every single time. So we did have to lean on F1, which, just as a quick reminder, is the intersection of precision and recall, which rewards actually catching those charged off loans. Ridge regression is our cautionary tale here. We had a near zero F1 score in grades A through D. It flagged almost no defaults in any of those grades. As we get a little higher in the risk grades, so E, F, and G, where the classes are a little bit more balanced, our logistic regression, the ridge regression did come through a little bit better. So let's take a closer look at that. As you can see here, default rate by credit grade, it does rise steadily from about 6% in grade A, all the way up through about 49, 50% in grade G. This is exactly why we modeled each grade separately. We wanted to make sure that we were able to separate those out. One really surprising result from this analysis was that loan purpose provided some signal. In a lot of cases, a borrower's reason for taking out a loan was provided, and these ranged from personal to small business to a wedding loan or auto financing. Small business loans actually had the highest default rate at almost 30%, while other purposes like wedding or personal loan were significantly less likely to default. So that was just something that we found really interesting in this data. All right, I'm going to kick it on back to Val. Thank you very much.
For research question 2, we ran 3 regression models. We ran linear regression, random forest regression, and light GBM. We evaluated these models using R-squared, RMSE, and MAE via a 10-fold cross-validation. We also ran each model twice, once with subgrade included, which was a feature, and one without. The reason we went about this was because we found that subgrade had the highest association and the highest influence, so we wanted to see how well the models were performing with and without that feature. With subgrade included, all 3 models achieved an R-squared value of 0.95, meaning the models explained over 95% of interest rate variation. That result makes sense since subgrade is the tier LendingClub already uses to set the rate, so it's largely reconstructing the label that encodes the answer. Without subgrade, the R-squared drops to around 0.50. The lowest it dropped to was 0.44 for the linear regression model. The strongest standalone predictors were the average FICO score and loan term, and the best MAE was 0.60 rate points. So what we found in our analysis is that linear regression served as our interpretable baseline. Coefficients show the direction and magnitude of each feature's effect directly. Without subgrade, a 60-month loan term alone added roughly 10 percentage points to the predicted rate. Random forest captured nonlinear interactions between features. Notably, it ranked loan term and FICO above individual subgrade levels in feature importance, even when subgrade was present. This suggested that borrower level signal exists beyond what the grade tier encodes. The light GBM model, which is a great gradient boosting method, was particularly well suited here, given the scale that we had 2.2 million loans. Its residuals were lightly centered at 0 with no directional bias, meaning it wasn't systematically over or under predicting in either direction. All 3 models overall seem to align with the idea that subgrade dominates the rate when present, and FICO and loan term are the strongest independent drivers when subgrade isn't in the picture. So when comparing all of our models, if we use RMSE as a primary metric, we find that with subgrade included, random forest achieved the best RMSE at 0.88 with like GBM close at 0.929. The linear regression trailed both, which is expected given that rate assignment has some nonlinear structure that a linear model can't fully capture. Without subgrade random forest and the light GBM model essentially tied and both outperformed linear regression by a meaningful margin, although very narrow. Random forest overall, as we can see, is our pick, like I said, by a very narrow margin. But the more important finding is that even without LendingClub internal grade, ensemble methods, aka random forest regression, and our light GBM model, still explain about half of rate variation using only borrower and loan features available at origination. So what drives the interest rate? This slide makes the subgrade effect concrete visually. Here we can see every model sits above a 0.95 bar squared when subgrade is included. When it's dropped, all three fall to roughly 0.50 with our linear regression model differentiating at 0.44 and the other two at 0.50. The same collapse across three very different modeling approaches tells us the consistency across linear, tree-based, and boosted methods tells us this isn't a modeling artifact. Subgrade genuinely carries most of the predictive information for rate, at least in LendingClub's internal system. When we look at which features matter most in the no subgrade models, the top 5 are the average FICO score, the loan term, revolving credit limit, loan amount, and debt to income ratio. Those were the top 5. However, the FICO score and the term led by a very wide margin. So the key takeaway here is that LendingClub pricing is largely mechanical once you know the grade, aka grade is influencing the interest rate. However, even without subgrade, we can still say that borrower credit quality and loan structure explain about half of the variation, which is still a meaningful takeaway and gives us some insight onto which other features besides grade or subgrade are impacting this interest rate in the LendingClub dataset.
This slide brings both of our research questions together and summarizes the main conclusions from the analysis. The first major takeaway is that LendingClub's credit grade is really the backbone of both default risk and interest rate pricing. For default risk, the grades create a clear ordering from lower risk borrowers in grade A to higher risk borrowers in grade G. That supported our decision to model default separately by grade, because otherwise the grade itself would dominate the model and hide the effects of other borrower features. The second takeaway is that default is difficult to predict with a high level of accuracy. Even our strongest classification model, logistic regression, reached an AUC of about 0.61. That is better than random guessing, but it's not strong enough to say that the model can reliably separate charged-off loans from fully paid loans on its own. The borrower and loan features do provide useful risk signals, but they do not fully explain why a loan defaults. The third finding is that interest rate prediction is much stronger. Once LendingClub's subgrade is included, the models explain almost all of the variation in interest rate. This suggests that predicting interest rate with subgrade included is really close to reconstructing LendingClub's internal pricing logic. Finally, borrower features still matter even when subgrade is removed. Without subgrade, the models still explain about half of the interest rate variation, with FICO score and loan terms standing out as the strongest independent predictors. So while subgrade is a dominant pricing feature, the underlying borrower characteristics still carry meaningful signal. Because this project deals with lending, the results cannot be viewed only from a technical perspective. These models affect real borrowers, so there are important ethical considerations. The first is financial inclusion. Risk-based lending models can unintentionally reinforce existing inequalities if they rely on variables that are connected to income, geography, or homeownership. For example, homeownership can improve a borrower's credit profile, but homeownership rates are not equally distributed across all groups. Because of that, lenders should test models for bias and make sure that risk prediction does not unfairly exclude certain borrowers. The second ethical issue is predatory pricing. Lenders have access to far more information than borrowers, and predictive models can estimate not only risk, but also what rate a borrower may be willing to accept. That creates a responsibility to make sure pricing reflects actual credit risk rather than simply charging the highest possible rate, especially for borrowers with fewer lending options. The third point is access to capital. Our analysis shows that loan purpose can be related to default risk. For example, small business loans tend to be riskier. However, if lenders respond by denying or heavily restricting those loans, it could limit opportunities for entrepreneurs and small businesses. The better approach is to price risk responsibly while still keeping access to credit open where possible. Overall, a recommendation is that predictive lending models should be used as decision support tools and not as automatic exclusion tools. They should improve consistency and risk management, but they should also be monitored for fairness, transparency, and responsible pricing. For next steps, we identified 4 main areas where the project could be improved with more time, more computing power, and additional data. The first is deeper modeling. We had limited time to tune every model as fully as possible, so future work could focus on resolving multicollinearity, running a full hyperparameter search, and testing additional models such as XGBoost, k-nearest neighbors, or even a neural network. These models may be able to capture more complex relationships, especially for default prediction, where our current results were modest. The second recommendation is to bring in macroeconomic context. The LendingClub data covers loans from 2007 through 2018, which includes very different economic conditions. Interest rates, unemployment, credit spreads, and the broader lending environment changed significantly over that period. Additionally, time-index microeconomic variables would help separate borrower-level risk from market-level conditions. The third recommendation is to work with LendingClub's grade system rather than try to work around it. Since grade and subgrade already encode so much of LendingClub's internal risk and pricing logic, future analysis could use grade as a grouping structure. For example, instead of asking what predicts interest rate overall, we could ask which borrower features explain rate differences within each grade. The fourth next step is to focus on the hard cases. In the interest rate models without subgrade, the models tended to underpredict the highest rate loans. That means the riskiest borrowers were the hardest to price accurately. Future models could add features, use weighting, or focus specifically on high-rate loans to improve performance in that part of the distribution. To conclude, the project shows that LendingClub's internal grade system is extremely powerful for pricing, but default prediction remains much more difficult. Future work should focus on improving default classification, adding economic context, and making sure any lending model is both accurate and ethically responsible. On behalf of KMOS Consulting, I want to thank Professor Schneider for his guidance, feedback, and support throughout the project. I also want to thank my teammates, Josh, Valerie, and Brian, for all the work that went into the data cleaning, modeling, analysis, visualizations, and presentation. This project had a lot of moving parts, and everyone contributed to getting it across the finish line. Finally, based on the amount of coffee consumed during this project, we may need to add caffeine intake as an unofficial predictor variable in our next model. Thanks again.